The hook begins with silence, and in that silence lies exile, not the kind enforced by chains, but by the weight of memory. These are Eldar who have been severed from their craft worlds, stripped not only of shelter, but of song. They walk beneath unfamiliar stars, hearing only echoes of the ones they once guided. Every step is both survival and mourning, because in the void, to be cut off from kin is to be cut off from destiny itself. Their armor is scarred, not by victory, but by carrying exile as a second skin. And yet, even in abandonment, they are not erased. For among the exiled, every whisper is legend, waiting to be carved in secrecy. If you wish to follow this journey of loss, endurance, and the fractured beauty of survival, remain with us. Like the stories etched into Wraithbone, your support keeps this chronicle alive. Subscribe, share, and carry the tale forward so that exile itself does not become silence. The ground was blackened long before their boots touched it. Ash rose with each step, not in plumes but in low sighs, as though the world itself had already exhaled its last. These were not the marching ranks of a craft world host, gleaming and precise in harmony. These were scattered figures, their once bright rune-etched armor dulled by neglect, their movements bound together only by the silence of exile. Each warrior carried more than a weapon, they carried the fracture of being cut from the chorus. It was not the loss of home alone that weighed on them, but the absence of song. The sudden void, where thousands of voices had once intertwined in psychic resonance. To live without it was to stumble in half-light, guided only by memory that grew thinner with every hour. Their landing had not been chosen. It was forced by dwindling supply, by failing systems, by the ache of survival with no promise of replenishment. The planet beneath them had no name worth repeating. It was barren, its surface scarred by old orbital strikes that had carved rivers of soot across plains of stone. Every breath carried the taste of burned metal. Every horizon was a smear of ruin. To a craft world-born soul, it was more than hostile. It was an insult to memory. No wraithbone towers, no flowing lines of harmony in architecture, no echoes of artistry, only jagged remains of something long dead, a world already emptied of meaning. The exiles spread in loose formation, not by command, but by instinct. The path of the warrior had not abandoned them, though it rang hollow without the certainty of purpose. Their helms scanned, their blades ready, but there was no enemy waiting in these wastes. The true adversary was silence. It crept between them, muting even the smallest gestures of unity on the craft world. A glance, a thought, a whisper of the mind was enough to bind warriors together. Here, their minds echoed only themselves, and the absence of connection gnawed worse than hunger. One of them, Eldar, paused at the crest of a rise where the wind drove ash into small, shifting dunes. His witchblade hummed faintly at his side, not in anticipation of battle but in protest. The weapon remembered the touch of the infinity circuit, remembered harmony. Now it was cut adrift, as its bearer was. Illithor did not speak, but his hesitation was loud. Others slowed, watching him, unwilling to break formation, yet unwilling to deny what they felt mirrored in their own hesitation. Ash swirled, a storm of dust that carried no sound but scraped along their armor like accusation. Rations were accounted for by rote, though they all knew the numbers dwindled. A warrior named Seller recorded the count on a cracked data slate. His gloved hands steady, though his voice, when he read the tally, trembled faintly beneath the helm. The figures were stark. Days, not weeks, before choices would be forced. Yet no one spoke of scavenging, of breaking their oath to purity of sustenance. Hunger was bearable. What was not bearable was the absence of direction. Hunger could be endured. Silence could not. When night fell, it was not with stars, but with haze. The sky above was shrouded in the remnants of bombardments, a blanket of smoke that erased constellations. The exiles gathered in a circle, not close enough to touch, not far enough to deny belonging. They attempted, as they always had, to meditate to align their thoughts as one. It began as a flicker, a familiar reaching outward. For a heartbeat, they felt the brush of each other's presence. Then it collapsed, not into clarity, but into static, a surge of psychic noise that rattled nerves, that sent shivers through even the most disciplined. The chorus was gone, and its absence had learned to scream. One broke first. A warrior tore off his helm and hurled it into the ash. His voice rose, raw and harsh, not in rage but in despair. It was not words he cried, but the sound of someone remembering song and being denied it. The others turned their eyes but did not restrain him. They could not. For his scream was their scream, and to silence it would be to silence themselves. The helm sank half buried in the ash. Its rune dimmed to nothing. Illithur retrieved it, wordless, brushing ash from the cracked surface. He placed it at the warrior's feet, a gesture not of forgiveness but of reminder. They might be cut off, abandoned, but even broken runes carried weight. To discard them was to discard identity, and without identity they were less than exile, they were void. The warrior took the helm back, trembling, and lowered it over his head again. The scream ended, but the silence after was heavier still. The night deepened. Some slept in armor, some remained wakeful, but none dreamed. Where once dreams had been windows into harmony, now they were empty corridors. A few whispered liturgies, half-remembered prayers to gods whose laughter had long been silenced. The words did not carry. They dissolved into the ash, like everything else. When dawn came, it was colorless. The ash plains stretched infinite, the sky still veiled. Yet they moved, because movement itself was defiance. To stay still was to admit that exile had consumed them, that ash had won. So they walked, boots crunching in rhythm, though each step was hollow. They marched not toward hope, but away from collapse. And in that fragile cadence of footsteps, there was the faintest echo of what had once been harmony broken, incomplete, but alive enough to keep them moving. The ash clung to them as they advanced, to armor, to weapons, to breath. It was not dust of soil, not dust of stone. It was memory ground to powder, remnants of something once alive. Every inhale was a reminder of loss. Every exhale, a confession that they carried the dead within them. Yet still, they walked. For abandonment is not the end of story. It is only its first taste. The moon turned beneath them like a shard of glass adrift in black void, its surface laced with fractures of frozen seas and jagged ridges that cut the horizon into shards of white. They descended without ceremony, not as explorers or conquerors, but as exiles searching for purchase. The first breath of the atmosphere bit deep through the seams of their armor, a cold so absolute it did not stink it hollowed. Frost began to cling instantly to their pauldrons, spiderwebbing across runes that once pulsed with inner light. What had survived, ash now faced silence in another form, the silence of endless ice. Snow fell not in flurries but in shards, each particle sharp enough to sting exposed seals, each gust erasing footprints as quickly as they were made. To march here was to leave no trace, as though the world itself conspired to deny that they had ever walked upon it. The craft worlds had taught them that memory was permanence, that every step, every word, every life threaded into the great weave of their people. Here, the weave frayed. Here, the snow consumed everything before it could root. Illithur led the column, his witchblade dark at his side, its resonance muffled by the weight of the cold. The weapon seemed to protest with every step, sluggish, unwilling to hum in his grasp. It was as though even spirit-forged steel could freeze, its voice muted beneath layers of frost. Behind him, Cellar carried the rations, their tally shrinking with each recalculation. His breath fogged within the helm, a rhythm of ghosts that clouded his visor. Numbers meant survival, yet survival here had no language. The moon's cold did not bargain. It consumed steadily, stripping warmth, stripping memory. stripping the small fragments of unity the exiles had clung to. By the third march hour, joints creaked beneath ceramite. Runes along armor dimmed to faint embers, their once bright glow choked by the invasive frost. Even the most disciplined began to slow, steps heavier, breaths ragged. And beneath the exhaustion lay something deeper, corrosion of resolve. Oaths whispered in exile, promises to endure, to outlast, began to sound fragile against the weight of white silence. For here, silence was not emptiness. It was weight, pressing down, filling every gap until there was no space left to speak. They made camp within the shadow of an ice-cracked ridge, huddled close, though no one admitted to the need. Heat modules flickered faintly, their glow anemic. Their hum lost against the winds that screamed endlessly across the plains. The exiles gathered around the machines as though around a shrine, but there was no comfort. Even in proximity, they felt the gulf between them widening. Without the psychic chorus, without the craft world to bind them, their unity was not song but proximity, and proximity phrase when cold seeps into the soul. One warrior name already half forgotten, as though the frost gnawed at identity itself set apart, armor still locked tight, helm bowed. His silence became heavier than the cold. When Ilithor approached, placing a hand upon his pauldron, the armor was brittle with frost. The warrior did not respond. When the helm was lifted, his face beneath was pale, lips blue, eyes unfocused, not dead, but emptied. He had not frozen in body. He had frozen in self. Whatever bound him to life had cracked in the cold and drifted away like snow caught in wind. The others watched, but did not speak. There was no mourning, no ritual to enact. To name the loss would be to admit that the same silence gnawed at all of them. So they simply turned their eyes away, leaving him seated in the snow, a statue of what they would become if resolve shattered. The storm covered him within hours, erasing him, leaving no marker. By nightfall, it was as though he had never existed. The path without chorus had no memory to hold him. Sleep was shallow, broken by the creak of ice shifting beneath the crust. Dreams no longer carried visions or guidance. They carried nothing. Warriors woke with the taste of frost in their throats, coughing as though trying to expel the emptiness lodged within their chests. Seller recalculated the rations again, his numbers growing darker with every count. He tried to speak the tally aloud, but the words froze in his throat. Ilithar gestured for silence. There was no need. The others already felt the truth in their bones. On the fourth day, frost claimed a weapon. A shuriken catapult cracked when its mechanism locked with ice. The warrior holding it dropped to his knees, staring at the ruin, not as loss of armament, but as loss of certainty. The weapon had been forged to endure war, yet it had not endured the cold. If the tools of the craft world faltered, what hope had those who carried them? His cry was muffled by his helm, but it carried through the group nonetheless. Low keening that was not anger, but grief. The column moved slower with each march, their formation loosening, steps falling out of rhythm. Once proud warriors began to stumble, their paths crooked, their resolve no longer binding them into unity. Whispers grew, indistinct, half-formed doubts. Some muttered that this was not exile, but judgment, that the gods they no longer named had consigned them to silence eternal. Others refused to speak at all, as though every word offered up to the air would be consumed and returned as frost upon their tongues. When the storm reached its peak, winds howled strong enough to scour runes from armor, stripping sigils from their surfaces until they marched faceless, indistinguishable, each warrior a figure erased by the elements. They leaned into the gale, their movements no longer elegant, but raw, survival, writ in awkward, heavy steps. For every stride forward, two were erased by the snow. It was as if the moon itself sought to consume even their memory, to write them out of existence one breath at a time. And yet, through the silence Ilithor walked on. His witchblade remained dim, but it remained whole. Every step he took cut faint grooves into the ice, lines that the wind could not entirely erase. The others followed, not because they believed, but because movement itself was the only oath left to them. To walk was to deny surrender, even if denial lasted only one more stride. By nightfall, they reached a plateau overlooking endless white. Nothing lived there, nothing breathed, nothing waited, only the cold. The exiles stood in formation, their breath fogging in pale ribbons, their armor encrusted in frost, their runes reduced to faint pulses. They said no words, made no vows. They simply endured. For here, endurance was all that remained of identity. The cold did not forgive. It did not relent. It did not remember. But still, they stood. The exiles marched beneath a sky of bruised clouds, their bodies weary, their steps uncertain, yet the weapons they carried never wavered. In silence and snow, blades hummed faintly, runes etched into their frames pulsing with dim light, as if they recalled songs their wielders had forgotten. For among the Eldar, weapons are never mere tools. They are memory carved into steel, spirit wrought into form, artistry bound to eternity. To hold one is to carry a fragment of craft-world permanence. And so, as warriors faltered, as discipline bent beneath cold and despair, it was the weapons that kept faith. Illithur felt it most keenly. His witchblade, dark silver forged with threads of psychic resonance, refused to dim even when frost covered its surface. He had not prayed in days, his mind too fractured to form liturgy. Yet the weapon whispered at the edge of thought, a rhythm steady as heartbeat. At times, he wondered if it urged him forward, not as master, but as servant. When he stumbled, it seemed to hum louder, as though chiding him, reminding him that exile could break the flesh, but not the lineage carved into its edge. Others carried shuriken catapults, their stocks wrapped in frost, ammunition drums clogged with ice. Yet, when triggered, the weapons still spat monomolecular discs into the white horizon, their fire true, precise, unerring. The warriors behind them sagged, but the weapons stood loyal. Each burst a defiance of cold and silence. A ghost blade, carried by a tall warrior whose name none now remembered clearly, glowed faintly even as its bearer faltered, the runes along its length refusing to surrender their light. Around the campfires, faint and flickering, the exiles sat in silence. Their words had grown scarce, stripped away by cold and hunger, but their weapons still sang in low tones, psychic murmurs brushing like ghosts across the edges of thought. A warrior once tried to lay his blade aside, declaring himself unworthy of it. The weapon responded with a low thrum that rattled the frozen ground, refusing to be forgotten. The warrior reclaimed it, trembling, ashamed not of his own weakness, but of the reminder that what he carried remembered more than he did. Cellar recorded their dwindling supplies, fingers stiff over the slate, numbers growing more dire each night. Yet, when he laid his catapult across his knees, he swore he felt heat radiating from it, as if the spirit woven into its core resisted despair. He whispered to it in silence, not as a prayer, but as apology. The weapon answered with vibration, faint but steady, as though forgiveness could come not from gods but from steel. Memory began to twist among them. Warriors forgot oaths spoken in the first days of exile, forgot faces beneath helms, even forgot the cadence of their own names. The cold gnawed at recollection as surely as hunger gnawed at flesh. Yet the blades did not forget. Each rune, each engraving remained sharp, uncorrupted. Their glow persisted when eyes dulled, their resonance persisted when voices faltered. They became, in their constancy, the only true record of what the exiles once were. One night, as storm winds howled across the plateau, a warrior fell in the snow, strength spent. His fellows moved to lift him, but before they could, his witchblade pulsed with sudden light. The blade hummed loud enough for all to hear, a cord vibrating against the storm. The warrior stirred, his eyes dull, his lips silent, but the weapon seemed to move in his stead. He rose, not out of will, but out of echo. He marched until his legs failed again, but the image lingered in the others' minds, a weapon carrying its bearer, memory dragging flesh through snow. Whispers began among them, not spoken aloud, but carried in the way they looked at their armaments. Some wondered if the weapons still remembered craft-world harmony, if they carried threads of the infinity circuit within their core. Others feared it, for if the blades remembered more than men, what place did exile hold for warriors stripped of memory? Were they protectors of relics, or had relics become guardians of them? Ilithar dreamed once, though dreams had nearly vanished in exile. In it, his witchblade stood upright in the snow, glowing as bright as any star. Around it lay forms helmless, faceless, indistinguishable. They were not warriors. They were remnants, but the blade remained, proud and unbroken, singing into the void. When he woke, frost clung to his armor, his breath shallow, but his hand already gripped the weapon tight. Its surface was warm, as though the dream had not ended. The silence among them grew heavier, yet the weapons filled it with faint sound. Shuriken catapults thrummed when checked, ghost blades whispered in pulses, witchblades hummed at the edge of hearing. The exiles had become shadows of themselves, names and oaths unraveling, but their weapons stood resolute. They were repositories of faith, artifacts that refused to surrender identity even as those who bore them dissolved into white silence. By the 7th march, the inversion was complete. Warriors no longer carried weapons. Weapons carried warriors. In every stride, in every breath, in every faint hum against the cold, it was not the exiles who remembered loyalty. It was the steel, the spirit-forged relics of craft-world artisans. Holding faith better than flesh, the march slowed not from exhaustion, but from the weight of words unspoken. For days they had trudged across the frozen plains, their bodies preserved by will, their weapons by memory. But their voices had been claimed by silence. When the first whisper finally came, it was not about food or direction, but about the gates, that labyrinth of light and eternity that had always bound them to their kin. It was gone, and its absence gnawed deeper than hunger or frost. But now someone dared to say it had not simply vanished. It had been closed. The rumor moved like a shadow between them, untraceable to origin, carried from helm to helm, in breaths too faint to name. One voice murmured that the craft world had sealed the passages to protect itself from contamination, that exile was not accident, but deliberate sacrifice. Another claimed it was punishment, that whatever unseen flaw or forgotten sin lay among the exiles had marked them unworthy, and the gates had folded shut as judgment. A third voice, quieter, darker, suggested that the webway itself had turned against them. Alive enough to decide, intelligent enough to sever. Ilithor did not speak, but he felt the words coil through his thoughts as surely as the wind clawed at his armor. He remembered the sensation of stepping into the webway, the hum of it beneath his feet, the chorus that resonated in every step. To imagine that it had chosen to close was worse than imagining enemies waiting on the other side. It meant the exile was not abandonment, but intention. At night, when they huddled in brittle circles around dim heat modules, the whispers grew bolder. Seller, his voice always steady with the cadence of a scribe, spoke of old myths. He recalled half-forgotten accounts of craft worlds that severed parts of themselves to survive, wounds inflicted not by war, but by choice. He described shrines sealed, corridors abandoned, entire halls left to silence so the greater whole might endure. If such sacrifices were made within, what prevented them from being made without? If a craft world could amputate its own limbs, could it not also amputate its own children? The thought coiled among them, insidious. Some nodded, silent, their faces hidden behind frost-crusted helms. Others looked away, refusing to give shape to fear. Yet even denial gave the rumor strength. For in exile, silence itself was fertile ground. What was unspoken grew larger, heavier, until it pressed on every chest like the cold. On the 6th night, one warrior spoke too loud. His name had been nearly erased by frost, but his voice carried through the camp. He declared that they had not been cast out at random, that their exile was orchestrated, calculated, that their craft world had chosen to close the webway against them, not to protect itself, but to rid itself of weakness. His words were fire in frozen air. Some rose to strike him, to silence him, but others held back, their weapons humming faintly as though listening. The confrontation ended without blood, but the crack had opened. No longer rumor, now belief. Illithor dreamed again. In the dream, the webway yawned before him, corridors of light stretching into eternity. But when he stepped forward, the gates folded like closing eyes. He pressed his hands against the wraithbone walls, but they pulsed not with rejection, not with hatred, but with indifference, a seal not made in rage, but in necessity. He woke with frost on his lips, his blade warm against his palm, and the echo of that indifference burning colder than any storm. The exiles marched slower now, not because their bodies weakened, but because their purpose frayed. If the webway had closed by choice, then exile was not chanced, was severance. Every step felt less like survival, and more like wandering in a wound, cut loose from the body that had decided it could no longer bear them. Around the fires, whispers grew stranger. Some claimed that exile was not punishment, but protection, that the cracked world had sealed them away to save them from some greater doom approaching. Perhaps their suffering was not abandonment, but shield. Perhaps they endured not because they were weak, but because they had been chosen. The contradiction festered, punishment or protection, condemnation or salvation. In silence, both possibilities thrived, indistinguishable. Sella wrote nothing now. His data slate lay dormant, frost crawling across its screen. Numbers no longer mattered. Survival could not be measured in rations or march hours when the foundation of belief itself cracked. He sat with his catapult across his knees, his eyes hollow, his lips moving faintly as if reciting equations that no longer bound meaning. The rumor was not an enemy one could strike. It was not a wound one could bind. It was a liturgy of dread, spreading without priest, without altar. In its presence, even oaths began to unravel. For what oath holds, if exile was chosen, if the webway had closed not by failure, but by intent? By the 9th march, the silence had changed. It was no longer absence. It was weight, pressing from all directions, carrying with it the question none dared to voice aloud. If exile was deliberate, then what were they now? Warriors without craft world, survivors without memory, shadows cut free from the web of destiny. The gates had not merely vanished. The gates had been sealed, whether in wrath, in mercy, or in indifference, no one could say. But the knowledge settled into every stride, into every breath, until each warrior felt the truth as keenly as frost upon their bones. They were not lost. They were unwanted. They gathered on a plateau of ice, their armor muted by frost, their weapons laid across their laps like votive offerings. For days, the whispers of closed gates had gnawed at them, bending their thoughts inward. To resist collapse, they returned to ritual, prayer, meditation, something that had always bound them together, something older than oaths, older even than exile. The attempt was not ordered. It emerged like instinct, as though memory itself guided their weary bodies into the circle. They sat, helms lowered, gauntlet hands resting across knees, breath fogged in unison, pale plumes rising into the frozen air. Illithor, seated at the circle's center, closed his eyes. He remembered the first time he had joined such a meditation aboard the craft world. The hum of countless voices blending into one harmony. The sensation of being lifted by currents of thought greater than himself. That memory steadied him. He reached outward, searching for resonance. At first, there was faint response. A brush of another's mind, Seller's voice flickering like a candle at the edge of perception. Another joined, then another. The circle pulsed faintly with the rhythm of unity. For a heartbeat, it seemed possible. The exile could be endured if the chorus survived within them. Then the sound came. Not harmony, not resonance, static. It began as a faint crackle, like frost grinding across Cum's channels. The exiles tightened their focus, straining to press past it, but the crackle grew. It hissed in their minds, spreading jagged across thought. Where one had reached for communion, they found only distortion. Seller recoiled first, clutching at his helm, the sound rattling in his skull. Another shouted aloud, breaking his silence as if struck by pain. The chorus did not form. It collapsed into jagged shrieks, noise without origin. Static that consumed instead of carried. Illithur tried to hold the thread, forcing his mind against the roar. For a moment, he thought he glimpsed something beneath the distortion, a pattern, or perhaps a voice. But it was not familiar. It was not kin. It was alien. His vision swam, ice cracking across his inner sight, and he tore himself free, gasping into the cold air. Around him, the others staggered, breaking the circle, some falling to their knees. The attempt had not restored them. It had fractured them further. Silence returned after, but it was not relief. It was ruin. The static lingered, ghosting at the edges of hearing. Some warriors pressed their hands to their helms, as though to muffle sound that was not there. Others stared outward across the wastes, refusing to meet any gaze. Refusing to admit the echo remained. That night, no one tried again. They sat apart, distance growing wider between them, the fire of their heat modules barely touching. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt watched, as though the static had not ended, only receded. Seller muttered equations under his breath, his voice shaking, as though numbers could shield him from the residue of that alien sound. Others simply refused to speak at all, as though every word might break into distortion before leaving their lips. On the second night, one warrior whispered a prayer aloud, soft, broken, a fragment of the old hymns. His voice trembled, but held. For a moment, it seemed possible, until the vox grill of his helm cracked with interference, the sound fracturing into static midway. He stopped, choking on silence, and no one dared continue. Prayer itself had turned against them. Illithur lay awake, his witchblade across his chest, listening. The static still pulsed faintly at the edge of thought, not gone, but waiting. He wondered if the collapse had been failure or revelation. Perhaps the chorus they sought no longer belonged to them. Perhaps exile was not absence, but replacement. Something else had claimed the silence. Something that spoke in distortion instead of song. On the third day, a decision unspoken took hold. No one suggested meditation again. No one risked prayer aloud. Instead, they walked in silence, letting boots strike ice in rhythm, letting breath fog in pale unison. The march became their liturgy, their movement, their prayer. Static could not invade steps. Silence could not fracture the act of walking. It was the only harmony left to them. But even in this, the memory of collapse lingered. Every glance, every pause carried the weight of dread. If even prayer could betray them, what sanctuary remained? They were not abandoned in silence. They were trapped within it, and silence had learned to answer. That night, Illithur dreamed again. He saw the craft world as it had been, vast corridors of wraithbone, light flowing like water through its veins. He walked those corridors, hearing voices rise in chorus. But when he drew closer, their tones dissolved, breaking into the hiss of static. He placed his hands against the wall. Wraithbone shivered beneath his touch, not alive with resonance, but alive with interference. He woke with frost on his lips, his witchblade humming faintly. For the first time, he did not feel it as comfort. He felt it as warning. The prayer had not ended in silence. It had ended in noise, and the noise had not been theirs. The path was never meant to be walked alone. It was discipline bound to chorus, ritual bound to architecture, every step affirmed by the craft world itself. Without it, the path was not guidance, but shape without meaning, a corridor without walls. One warrior, Caruth, still tried. He was quiet, even among exiles, a figure who carried himself with rigid devotion, while others slept in restless shifts or sat in silence around dim heat. Carith rose before dawnlight and enacted the rites of the warrior path. He bowed, his movements precise, his witchblade laid in front of him as if before an altar. He recited words etched into his memory from centuries of training, but the words carried no echo. The air did not receive them. The discipline was hollow, each phrase collapsing into silence before its end. Illithur watched him from a distance, his own blade resting against his shoulder. At first he admired the persistence. Some part of him wanted to believe ritual could anchor them, but as days passed, the admiration soured into unease. The more rigidly Carith repeated the path, the more it seemed he was not walking it, but being consumed by it. Each motion grew sharper, not with precision, but desperation. His footfalls made no sound upon the snow. His blade arcs cut the air without whisper. It was as though the world itself refused to acknowledge him. He performed every stance flawlessly, yet the silence swallowed all trace. Others began to avoid watching him. To see his rites was to be reminded that discipline without chorus was emptiness rehearsed. By the seventh morning, Carith's voice faltered. He tried to chant the warrior's litany, the verses that once united him with brothers across the craft world, but the words cracked in his throat. Static lingered at their edges, the same distortion that had poisoned prayer. He stopped mid-verse, eyes narrowing behind the frost of his helm, and struck the ground with his blade. The blow carved a line into ice, but the sound was muffled, as if swallowed before it reached their ears. Seller approached him once, data slate in hand, voice low. He asked if Carith's rituals brought him strength, if they preserved memory. Carith did not answer. He simply raised his blade and repeated his stance, his body locked in perfect geometry. Seller stepped back, unease in his posture. To him it seemed the path had ceased to be Carith's guide. It had become his cage. That night, the exiles marched into a canyon where frost clung in curtains along the walls. Carith walked ahead, his strides steady, each step placed as though along invisible tiles. He muttered fragments of liturgy, syllables lost to static before they reached even his own ears. Behind him, others faltered, their rhythm broken, unable to follow steps that left no trace. Illithur dreamed again. He saw Carith walking a corridor of wraithbone, endless, seamless, the floor gleaming with light. But as Illithur followed, his own footsteps echoed while Carith's made none. Carith advanced further, silent, untouchable, disappearing into brightness. When Illithur reached out, his hand met only empty air, the figure already erased by silence. He woke, gasping, the dream clinging like frost across his chest. On the 9th day, Carith stopped marching with them. He lingered behind, repeating stances in the snow. The others called out, their voices muted, but he did not respond. He seemed not to hear. His body bent and flowed, perfect in motion, yet his movements left no impression. Snow did not scatter at his strikes. The ice beneath his feet did not crack. He moved as if no longer bound to the world at all. When they returned to find him, he was still there. His blade hung at his side, his form rigid, his helm lowered. For a moment they thought him frozen, lifeless, but then his chest rose faintly, his breath fogging. He was not dead. He was simply still, as though the path itself had pinned him into place. Illithur knelt before him, placing his hand against Carith's shoulder. Frost cracked beneath his touch. He spoke Carith's name. There was no response. He shook him, and Carith's body moved like a statue, unsettled. stiff but intact. His eyes, visible through the visor's frost, stared forward into nothing. He was alive, but already beyond them. They left him there, not from cruelty, but because they could not bear to carry him. To drag him along would have been to drag silence itself. And so Kareth remained in the canyon, a figure locked in ritual, unmoving. His footsteps already erased before they could be made. The exiles marched on, quieter than before. None spoke of the path again, for they all felt it. Now, the hollow geometry of ritual without chorus, the emptiness of discipline performed in void. They carried blades that remembered better than they did, but the corridors of memory no longer welcomed their steps. The path had not abandoned them. They had abandoned themselves within it, and each stride forward was proof that no footsteps remained behind. Rations dwindled to nothing more than fragments of nutrient wafers and sips of thawed ice. The exiles no longer measured time by hours or days, but by the rhythm of their hunger. At first, the pangs were dull, a constant throb beneath armor. Then they sharpened, twisting into voices that pressed against the edges of thought. Absence itself had begun to speak. Ilithur noticed it while standing watch upon a ridge. The wind howled across the ice, carrying no sound but its own endless scream. Yet, within the ache of his stomach, he heard cadent syllables formed, not by tongue but by emptiness. The voice promised warmth, promised memory. It told him that hunger was not enemy, but teacher, stripping away illusion until only truth remained. He shook his head, gripping his witchblade, but the voice lingered. Hunger had learned to sing. Others began to show signs. Cellar muttered numbers that no longer aligned to supply, his equations bending into verses. A warrior whispered to his shuriken catapult as though it were kin. Convinced, the growl in his gut echoed the hum of its core. Around the heat module, their breaths shallow, they began to sway faintly, as though the pangs within their bellies set rhythm to unseen hymns. The hunger voice was not cruel. It was soothing. It did not demand. It promised. It told them the emptiness inside was not void but presence, something greater than the chorus they had lost. Where prayer had dissolved into static, hunger offered a new liturgy, one carved into flesh rather than song. On the fifth night, without rations, one warrior laughed suddenly, helm tilted back, voice raw. He claimed the hunger had spoken his true name, one he had forgotten since exile began. He repeated it until the syllables collapsed into soundless gasps, but his eyes glowed with conviction. The others listened in silence, some horrified, others yearning for their own revelation. Ilithur resisted longest. He clenched his teeth, forcing his focus upon the rhythm of marching, the hum of his blade. But even he began to hear music in the emptiness. At night, when he closed his eyes, the pangs in his stomach pulsed like drumbeats, the ache swelling into harmonies. He woke sweating, his throat raw as if he had sung in his sleep. His witchblade thrummed faintly, not in protest but in resonance. Hunger had invaded even the relics. The exiles no longer ate sparingly. They no longer ate at all. When fragments of supply remained, they set them aside, untouched. To consume was to silence the song, and silence had become unbearable. They chose instead to starve, not in despair, but in devotion to the voice that grew clearer with each hollowing of flesh. Marching became ritual. With every step, the pangs deepened, harmonizing across their bodies. Where once their chorus had failed, hunger unified them. They walked in rhythm to the gnawing, their silence no longer empty, but filled with pulse. Cellar collapsed first. His knees buckled, his data slate falling into snow. He did not weep. He smiled faintly, whispering that the hunger had told him he was not forgotten. When he stopped breathing, the others did not wail. They stood in stillness, listening, as though his voice had joined the liturgy of absence. They left him unburied, certain the snow would preserve what the hunger had consecrated. Ilithur feared then not of death, but of surrender. He could no longer tell if the voice belonged to hunger, or if hunger was merely vessel. He clutched his blade, whispering the old litanies, but the words cracked into static. The ache within him responded with song, clearer than prayer had ever been. He marched onward, unsure if he followed his own will, or a hymn carved from emptiness itself. By the 9th day, their bodies were gaunt, within armor, movements brittle, eyes sunken, yet they did not falter. They carried themselves like priests, steps steady, breath ragged hymns. Hunger had not weakened them, it had transfigured them. They no longer survived in defiance of absence. They survived by serving it, and in the silence of that frozen plain, their voices rose not in chorus of memory, but in hunger's hymn. The first sighting came at dawn, when pale light bled weakly through clouds. Figures moved along the ridge above the exiles, marched slender, armored. For a heartbeat, Ilithur thought them saviors, kin who had come to gather the exiled back into the fold. The angle of their helms, the curve of their armor, the way they moved, everything sang of familiarity. Then came the colors, not the muted hues of craft worlds, nor the dull frost of exile, but a patchwork of scavenged brilliance, enamel cracked by years of plunder. Corsars. The exiles froze, their breath fogging, weapons raised. The corsairs descended like shades of memory twisted, their laughter sharp against the wind. They bore the elegance of Eldar still bound to song, but their voices were jagged, too free, untethered to path or craft world. To face them was to face what exile could become if discipline fractured completely. The skirmish began without declaration. Shuriken fire sang across the plateau, cutting white arcs through the snowstorm. The exiles answered in kind, their catapults humming faithfully, their blades humming louder still. Ghost blades clashed with sabers etched in stolen sigils, witchblades flared, meeting mirror-bright daggers, looted from dead kin. Every strike was recognition. Every wound was memory reopened. Ilithur engaged a corsair, who moved with terrible grace, her helm etched with patterns he half remembered from shrines now sealed. Their blades crossed, and in the hum of steel he heard echoes of craft-world hymns twisted into something sharp. She laughed as they fought, not cruelly, but with the abandon of one unshackled. Her strikes were not disciplined, yet they carried a freedom his arms could not match. For a moment, he faltered. Was she enemy? Or was she proof that exile need not be silence? Her blade cut across his pauldron, sparks scattering. He answered with a strike that split her helm, revealing eyes that gleamed not with malice, but with recognition. She fell, and Ilithur staggered, unsure if he had slain an enemy or a reflection. Elsewhere, Cellar fired relentlessly, his catapult shrieking into the storm. He struck down one corsair, then another, yet each death left him hollow. They were kin in form, kin in blood, their bodies folding into the snow like exiles themselves. When one corsair collapsed at his feet, Cellar lowered his weapon, staring into a face that could have been his brother's. The corsair's lips moved, whispering a word Cellar could not hear over the storm. By the time he leaned closer, the snow had filled the mouth, silencing it forever. The clash dragged on, not long in hours, but eternal in weight. Blades cut, armor cracked, snow drank the blood of kin, yet through it all lingered recognition. No hatred drove them, only necessity. The corsairs fought for plunder, the exiles for survival. Their strikes met in a rhythm not of enemies, but of mirrors, locked in desperate cadence. When the storm broke, silence reclaimed the plateau. The corsairs withdrew, leaving half their number in the snow. The exiles stood among bodies, their weapons glowing faintly, their breath ragged. No victory, cry rose. No lament either, only silence, heavy and uncertain. Ilithur knelt by the fallen corsair he had slain. Her broken helm revealed a face unscarred, ageless, beautiful, even in death. He touched her blade, still humming faintly, still carrying the resonance of kinship. It pulsed against his gauntlet, refusing to fade. He wondered if her weapon, too, remembered better than flesh. He left it in the snow, unwilling to take it as spoil, unwilling to abandon it either. The others moved quietly among the dead, searching not for loot, but for answers. They found fragments of data slates, tokens of plundered craft worlds, shards of wraithbone carved into crude talismans, proof that corsairs had walked where the exiles once lived, touched what they had lost, desecrated what they had been denied. And yet, in the curve of their armor and the shape of their faces, they were still kin. That night, the exiles sat apart, their camps scattered. No one spoke of the corsairs directly, but all felt the wound. To fight orcs, humans, or necrons was survival. To fight corsairs was self-dismemberment, enemy and mirror blurred until the distinction dissolved. In the silence that followed, hunger's song felt louder, more insistent, filling the void left by recognition. Tar lay awake, staring at the pale sky. He saw again the eyes of the corsair he had killed, eyes that had recognized him, even as his blade ended her life. He realized exile was not absence alone, it was confrontation with reflections twisted into new shapes. In that skirmish, he had not slain an enemy. He had slain a future he might yet become. The battle with the corsairs had left the exiles ragged. Armor hung dented, runes dimmed, and the snow was still stained faintly pink where kin had fallen. Yet the greater wound was not in flesh. It lay within silence, the recognition that what they had fought were mirrors, not monsters. In that silence, the next fracture came not of blade or shield, but of identity itself. It happened during an ambush. A band of human scavengers had descended upon the exiles, crude weapons flashing, their eyes wide with hunger for spoils. Against disciplined Eldar, they were no threat, but desperation made them reckless. Bolter rounds shrieked across the ice, and in the clash, a warrior's helm split. The sound was sharper than gunfire, a crack across ceramite, loud as a scream. The helm shattered beneath the blow, shards scattering into frost. The warrior staggered back, face revealed. For a moment, the others turned their gaze, expecting to see kin beneath the mask. But what they saw was absence. The face was not scarred, not ruined. It was empty, eyes dulled to glass, lips parted but wordless, expression hollow. It was as though the helm had not concealed identity, but created it. Without it, the warrior was no one, neither exile, nor kin, nor self. The mask had carried meaning. The face beneath had none. The scavengers fell quickly, their corpses strewn across the snow. Yet none of the exiles celebrated. They stood in a half-circle around the unhelmed warrior, blades lowered, unsure if they looked upon brother or ghost. He did not raise his eyes to meet theirs. He simply touched the fragments of his helm, fingers trembling, as though he searched for himself among the broken shards. Illithur approached, his witchblade humming faintly. He spoke the warrior's name. No response. He repeated it, louder. Still silence. The warrior lifted his gaze at last, but the eyes that met Illithor's were void. No recognition, no allegiance, no self. It was not madness. It was erasure. That night, the warrior sat apart from the circle. He did not eat, did not sleep, did not speak. The others tried not to look at him, but their gazes strayed nonetheless. They whispered among themselves. Had he lost his spirit stone? Had the path consumed him? Or had the helm itself been the only vessel of identity he possessed? None dared answer aloud. Seller, always the scribe, recorded what he saw in his slate. A mask cracked, a man gone. What remains when the vessel is broken? He closed the slate quickly, after writing, as if ashamed of giving thought permanence. The days after, the unhelmed warrior marched with them, but his steps were hollow. He followed formation, yet seemed detached from rhythm, as though he imitated what he no longer understood. When asked to take position, He hesitated, his weapon lowered. In battle, he fought mechanically, his strikes precise but without urgency, as though he acted from memory rather than intent. Ilithar watched him closely. Each night, he hoped to see flicker of self-return in expression, a word, a glance of recognition, but none came. The warrior became like Wraithbone, stripped of song, form intact, spirit absent. One night, in a storm that buried their tracks as quickly as they made them, the unhelmed warrior stood watch. At dawn, he was gone. No trace of struggle, no trail in the snow, nothing left but the fragments of his shattered helm laid neatly at the camp's edge. As though he had placed them there deliberately, a final acknowledgement of what he had been, or of what he had lost. The exiles searched briefly, calling his name across the wastes. But there was no answer, no echo. He had dissolved into the silence, absorbed by exile as surely as snow absorbed blood. That evening, none spoke during camp. Each warrior touched their own helm, fingers brushing runes and plates as though to ensure they remained whole. For the mask was no longer armor, it was identity. To crack it was not to risk death, it was to risk erasure. Ilithar sat alone, his helm intact but heavier than ever. He wondered how much of himself remained behind it. Was he Ilithar because he remembered, or because the mask reminded him? If exile stripped away chorus, stripped away path, stripped away craft world, then what was left? Flesh, armor, weapon, and if armor cracked, what then? The silence answered with nothing. They found the fragments buried in the ice at the base of a shattered ridge. Pale curves of wraithbone, veins of once living architecture, now brittle and silent. The sight struck them all with a jolt that hunger and cold could never provoke. For here was a remnant of home, a trace of the craft worlds themselves, carried into exile by accident of ruin. Weapons remembered, yes, but this was memory itself. Wraithbone was never only structure. It was song, alive with resonance, a bridge to the infinity circuit. To find it in the wastes was to glimpse salvation. Ilithar reached first, gloved fingers brushing the surface. He expected warmth, the faint pulse of spirit threads humming beneath his touch. Instead, there was only chill. The surface was inert, dead as stone. He pressed harder, closing his eyes, whispering liturgy meant to awaken slumbering fragments. Still nothing. His witchblade hummed faintly at his side, but the wraithbone remained mute, as though it had forgotten how to sing. The others gathered, each taking their turn. Sela recited equations of resonance, mapping patterns meant to coax ancestral voices into response. Another warrior held a spirit stone aloft, pressing it against the pale surface, willing it to glow. It stayed dark, absorbing light instead of giving it. They tried chants, tried meditations, even allowed hunger's hymn to seep through their lips. Nothing answered. Frustration grew. One warrior struck the wraithbone with his blade, sparks leaping against pale surface. Still silence. Another tore his helm away, pressing his forehead to the curve, whispering names of ancestors, names once etched into shrines. The only reply was the whistle of wind across the ridge. Ilithar sank to his knees, his hand pressed flat against the cold material. He remembered his youth, standing before living walls of the craft world, hearing them hum beneath his breath, knowing the voices of the dead wove themselves into every scene. To feel nothing now was not absence alone, it was betrayal. Memory had abandoned them. Sela recorded it into his slate. The song of Wraithbone is gone. The stones no longer carry the dead. If memory does not answer, are we still remembered? He closed the slate with trembling hands, as though afraid the act of writing might erase him further. Night fell heavy. They lit no fire. The fragments of Wraithbone lay in the snow, pale against darkness, inert. Warriors sat in a circle, spirit stones clasped in their palms, trying one last time to call forth echoes of ancestors. One by one, they pressed the stones to their helms, to their blades, to the fragments. No glow, No voice. Nothing but silence, stretching wider, deeper. Then came distortion. A faint crackle, at first mistaken for static on the vox. But it did not fade. It deepened, seeping into the stones themselves. The exiles froze, listening. It was not chorus, not harmony. It was jagged, wrong, the same sound that had shattered prayer. The spirit stones hissed, as though memory itself had been overwritten by noise. One warrior screamed and cast his stone into the snow. Another clutched his tighter, refusing to believe, whispering to it desperately as though words could erase static. Elithor held his own, staring at the faint frost coating its surface. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw light flicker within. Then it collapsed into distortion, dissolving before his eyes. They sat in silence, broken only by the hiss that lingered faintly, like a voice corrupted. For the first time, the exiles did not merely feel forgotten. They felt erased. The Wraithbone no longer remembered them. The stones no longer carried their ancestors. Even memory itself had turned. When dawn broke, the fragments lay untouched. None dared carry them. To hold them was to risk hearing that static again, to feel the weight of abandonment sharpened into certainty. They marched on, leaving the pale remnants half buried in frost. Elithor glanced back once, watching the ridge fade into haze. He felt as though he had left more than relics behind. He had left proof that memory itself could die. His witchblade hummed faintly, the only sound of loyalty remaining. But even that he no longer trusted fully. The snow swallowed the fragments as they moved onward. No voices rose. No song remained. Only silence and static lurking beneath it. The first shadow fell at midday. Clouds had often dimmed the exiles' march. Storms had blotted out the sun for hours. But this was different. The light dimmed with unnatural slowness. The sun itself shrouded behind a disk that grew wider, heavier, until the land was plunged into eclipse. They raised their eyes, helms tilted back, and felt the cold deepen. An eclipse was meant to pass, a fleeting alignment of bodies in the void. But this one did not shift. Hours dragged by, yet the disk remained fixed, blackening the sky, strangling every trace of color. Pale snow turned gray. Armor dulled further. Even runes that still glowed seemed suffocated beneath the oppressive dark. It was not night, nor storm. It was residence. Elithor felt it settle across his shoulders like a cloak of iron. His witchblade hummed faintly, as though unsettled by what it could not cut. The darkness was not simple absence. It was deliberate, a closing of the sky. He remembered ancient hymns whispered on the craft-world, songs of the cosmos conspiring against their kind, of stars dimming when Eldar pride grew too bright. Superstition, perhaps. Yet here, in exile, superstition carried the weight of truth. The exiles halted their march, forming a loose circle beneath the stagnant eclipse. Silence stretched. No one dared break it, for their voices already felt muted by the sky. Even to speak seemed an affront, as though sound itself could not exist beneath this shadow. Seller finally lifted his slate, tracing lines of calculation across the screen, his breath fogging in frustration. He muttered that such alignment was impossible, that orbital paths could not sustain eclipse beyond a handful of hours. Yet, as he spoke, his numbers faltered, the equations dissolving into static on the slate. He dropped it into the snow, staring at his hands as if betrayed by logic itself. As the day bled into false night, unease sharpened into dread. The eclipse did not end. The cold thickened, frost climbing higher across their armored plates, cracking runes into silence. Even their weapons seemed subdued, their faint hums choked. The world around them blurred into grayscale, each warrior no more distinct than shadow. Hunger's voice, once sharp within their bellies, quieted now, as though even absence was muted. One warrior broke. He tore his helm free and screamed at the sky, his voice raw, demanding light, demanding end. But the sound carried no distance. It was swallowed instantly, cut short as though the air itself refused to bear it. His scream ended, not in silence, but in nothingness, erased before the others could hear its final note. He fell to his knees, trembling, his mouth still open though no sound emerged. Illithur moved to him, placing a hand on his shoulder, but found no words of comfort. What words mattered beneath a sky that refused even sound? He guided the warrior back to formation, though his eyes lingered on the black disk above, a wound in the heavens that refused to close. Night came again, yet the eclipse held. Stars that should have emerged never pierced the darkness. The exiles camped without fire, for flame itself seemed smothered. Sparks caught, flickered, then guttered into ash. They huddled together in darkness absolute, unable to mark time, unable to distinguish sleep from waking. Some began to pray, whispering to stones they no longer trusted. Others pressed their weapons close, as though steel could hold memory when the sky would not. Illithur remained still, his blade across his knees, his gaze fixed on the unchanging disk. He tried to imagine light returning, but the thought faltered. The eclipse had ceased to be moment, it was state, a new law written into void. By the third day, despair took shape. Warriors began to doubt movement itself, their steps hesitant, uncertain whether distance meant anything when the sky no longer turned. Without light, direction dissolved. They wandered in spirals, their formation fraying, each warrior drifting as though tethered only faintly to the others. Seller muttered again, not equations this time, but fragments of hymns. He claimed the eclipse was no accident of orbit, no conspiracy of stars. He said it was punishment proof that even the heavens had closed against them. Others argued weakly, saying it was protection, a veil shielding them from something worse. Their words dissolved quickly, voices barely audible before being consumed. In the end, neither explanation mattered. What mattered was that the sky no longer remembered them. Illithur dreamed beneath that unbroken shadow. In his dream, he walked the corridors of his craft world, light pouring from wraithbone walls. But when he lifted his eyes, the ceilings had vanished, replaced by the black disk above. It loomed vast, pressing downward, crushing every song into silence. He woke with frost coating his helm, his breath shallow, the dream indistinguishable from waking. On the fifth day, the eclipse finally shifted. Slowly, agonizingly, the edge of the disk drew away, bleeding a thin blade of light across the horizon. The exiles raised their eyes in disbelief, their bodies trembling as if warmth had returned to their veins. Yet the relief was thin. The light that emerged was pale, weaker than before, stripped of strength. It did not restore them. It reminded them only that darkness could choose to stay. They marched on beneath the one glow, but none spoke of hope, for they knew now the sky itself could turn against them, withholding even the promise of day. And when they glanced upward, they half expected the disk to return, to seal them once more in silence eternal. The eclipse had ended, but its truth lingered. Darkness was no longer absence, it was residence. And residence, once claimed, does not leave. It happened in silence, as all things did among the exiles. A cry should have pierced the cold, a sound sharp enough to cut through frost and eclipse. But instead the birth was muted, a thin whimper swallowed by snow and wind. They gathered around the mother where she lay against stone, armor discarded, her body gaunt, yet determined. In her arms, wrapped in scraps of fabric torn from a cloak, rested the child. Flesh too small, too fragile, too new for a world that had already forgotten light. For a long time, no one moved. Warriors stood frozen, their weapons slack at their sides, their helms tilted down toward the bundle. They had seen countless deaths, endured hunger, silence, the betrayal of memory itself. But to see a beginning here, in exile, struck them deeper than any wound. A child among the lost, a voice where none remained, a future where none had been promised. The mother held it close, her breath shallow, her body trembling with weakness. She whispered words no one else could hear, her lips shaping syllables swallowed before they reached the air. When she looked up at the circle of warriors, her eyes pleaded for recognition, for acknowledgement, but none answered. To name the child was the unspoken duty of kin. Names were bonds, threads woven into the infinity circuit, affirmations of belonging to the great chorus. But the exiles were cut from that chorus. They carried no authority, no craft world behind them, no voices to affirm. To name the child would be to bind it to nothing, and none dared make such a wound. Seller, ever the scribe, lifted his slate. He tried to etch symbols, searching for a word that might suffice. His hand trembled, and the screen remained blank. He whispered, "A name is not ours to give." He set the slate aside. The others shifted uneasily. One warrior muttered that perhaps the craft world had sent this child as test. Another, that it was curse, a reminder of their severance. But their voices died quickly. The child stirred faintly in the mother's arms, its whimper barely more than breath, and silence returned. Illithor stepped forward at last. He knelt beside the mother, his witchblade resting flat upon the ice. He gazed into the child's face, a face unmarked by exile, untouched by silence. For a moment, he felt the faintest echo of chorus stir within him, as though the presence of new life opened a door memory had closed. But the echo collapsed almost instantly, drowned in static. He lowered his eyes, ashamed of hope. Days passed, and the child remained nameless. They referred to it only as the child, never daring to shape more. Yet it became center of their march, the fragile core around which the exiles arranged themselves. The mother grew weaker, her body consumed by hunger, but she refused to let go. Each step she took was agony, yet she held the bundle firm, as though the act of carrying it was itself liturgy. The exiles changed around it. Warriors, who had walked in silence, began to hum faintly, low tones meant not for prayer, but to soothe. Their weapons glowed brighter when they formed watch over the child, runes pulsing faintly, as if spirit-forged steel recognized the weight it bore witness to. Even hunger's voice softened, its song bending into lullaby. But dread followed closely, for what future could exist here, beneath a sky that refused light, among warriors who no longer remembered themselves? Each night, the child slept between them, its breath shallow but steady, and each warrior lay awake, haunted by what it represented. It was not just life. It was proof that something had been stolen: kinship, craft world, belonging. This child should have been named in light, in song, among shrines and wraithbone. Instead, it breathed nameless into silence. On the seventh night, the mother's breath failed. She slumped forward, arms still curled protectively around the bundle. Illithor lifted her gently, his hands trembling. The others stood in silence, not weeping, not praying, for grief had no voice left. They placed her body into the snow, her arms still locked around the child until Illithor pried them free. He carried the infant, its tiny fingers clutching at his gauntlet, its face pressed against cold armor. They buried her slowly, the storm already moving to cover what their hands could not. The child did not cry. It breathed, steady and quiet, as though accepting exile as inheritance. Now, the exiles marched with Illithor at the center, the nameless child in his arms. None spoke of naming it. To bind it would be to lie, to promise what they could not give. Yet all understood the weight it carried. It was not just symbol of survival, it was reminder of all that had been lost. A living absence, fragile and undeniable. At night, they gathered around it, their circle closer than it had been in weeks. They did not speak, did not attempt prayer. They simply listened to the soft rhythm of its breath, the only sound among them that did not carry static, the only voice untouched by betrayal. The child slept nameless, and in its namelessness, it bore the truth of exile: to exist without binding, to endure without song, to live without memory. a reminder not of what they were, but of what they could never again be. The dead did not vanish quickly in the wastes. Frost preserved them, snow wrapped them in shrouds of white, and silence laid them among the living as reminders. The exiles marched with corpses at their backs, comrades, left unburied, their forms half sunken into drifts, helms tilted upward as though still watching the eclipse-darkened sky. It was after one such battle against scavengers that the first whisper came. The warrior had fallen 3 nights prior. His name was already dim in memory, his voice forgotten, his oath erased by hunger's hymn. His body lay where it had dropped, armor cracked but intact, frost coating the runes inscribed across his chestplate. When Illithur passed by, carrying the nameless child close, he noticed the faintest flicker of light. At first he thought it a trick of the dying sun, a glimmer across ice. But as night settled and darkness pressed closer, the glow remained. Runes lit faintly, one by one, their sequence alien. These were not the warrior's heraldry, nor the craft world's script. The patterns glowed in cadence, pulsing like heartbeat, shifting until they formed sigils no one recognized. Illithur crouched near, hand upon his witchblade, uncertain, and then came the whisper. It did not emerge from lips. It came from the armor itself, faint at first, then rising, a susurrus of syllables. No one had spoken yet, all seemed to half remember. The sound was not static. It was structured, almost melodic, as though words were straining through a voice not built to hold them. The warriors froze, staring at the corpse, their own breaths shallow. The child stirred faintly in Illithur's arms, but did not cry. Cellar stepped closer, slate in hand, his fingers trembling as he tried to transcribe the sigils. But the marks shifted before his eyes, altering even as he wrote them. He dropped the stylus, whispering that no pattern held, that meaning dissolved the moment it was grasped. Yet the voice continued, steady, whispering through frost and ruin. The exiles argued in hushed tones. Some said it was spirit, the fallen warrior's essence refusing to fade, clawing through armor to reach them. Others hissed it was madness, hallucination born of hunger and exile. A few said nothing at all, only stared at the glowing sigils with reverence, as though watching liturgy unfurl. Illithur pressed his palm to the runes. The glow brightened, the whisper sharpened. He thought he heard his own name, syllables stretched and broken, carried not as memory, but as command. He recoiled, his witchblade thrumming at his side as if in warning. Yet when he turned, the others were already leaning closer, their helms bent low, their ears straining. The voice spread. By dawn, the corpse lay covered in frost again, its runes dim. But another armor glowed that night, different corpse, different pattern, different voice. The whispers carried not in unison, but in sequence, as though an unseen chorus was moving from one vessel to the next, weaving a chain of murmurs that bound the exiles in restless wakefulness. Soon even the living felt it. Warriors lying half asleep heard faint vibrations in their own armor, runes warming against their skin, voices brushing across the edges of hearing. Not words they understood, but tones that tugged at the marrow of thought. The exiles did not resist. They listened, for silence had betrayed them, hunger had sung, prayer had fractured. Now armor itself spoke, and they hungered for meaning. Cellar whispered that exile was birthing new gods, that when craft worlds sealed their gates, when Wraithbone refused to sing, when stones answered only with static, something else had filled the void. He spoke not in fear, but in awe, as though the whispers were proof of ascension. Others recoiled, calling it blasphemy, but even their protests were quiet, for each of them, in solitude, felt the same resonance in their armor, the same pull to listen. Illithur feared, not for himself, nor even for the child. He feared because the whispers did not feel alien. They felt intimate. They carried fragments of thought, shards of memory, as though the voices came not from beyond but from within the pieces of self they had lost, reshaped and spoken back to them. When he listened too long, he felt his own voice unravel, syllables falling away into the cadence of the armor's speech. The corpses multiplied. With every battle, with every collapse, more runes flickered awake, more voices joined the chain. The dead became louder than the living. Their armor glowed across the camps at night, pale beacons muttering into the dark, forming sigils in snow that no one dared disturb. The exiles no longer avoided them. They gathered around, seated like supplicants at shrines, waiting for phrases to emerge. One night, Ilithar dreamed not of the craft world, not of Wraithbone, but of fields of empty armor standing upright, glowing with shifting runes, whispering in unison. No bodies remained inside them, only voices, endless and patient. He woke trembling, but when he glanced around the camp, he saw his dream, already of armors glowing faintly, whispers moving from corpse to corpse, from shell to shell. The exiles no longer marched as before. They walked in silence, heads bowed, listening to the faint murmurs that followed them. Their weapons were steady, their formation loose, but their thoughts bent toward the whispers, toward the glowing runes that rewrote memory into something unfamiliar. The child slept soundly through it all, its tiny breaths steady. Ilithar wondered if it already belonged more to the voices than to the living. In exile, armor remembered better than men, and now it began to speak. Whether spirit, madness, or divinity, none could deny it. The silence of abandonment had been replaced not by chorus, not by hunger, but by whispers from steel, and the exiles listened. Sleep no longer offered rest. It offered visions, not nightmares, not even dreams, but fragments of lives none of the exiles could claim as their own. They came without pattern, spilling into the silence of exhausted minds. A warrior would wake trembling, whispering details of battles fought on ships he had never seen, corridors of Wraithbone he had never walked. Another would speak of children she had never borne, of lovers long dead who had never touched her. Each swore their visions were true, each knew they were not. The first time it happened, they dismissed it as hunger's residue, illusions spun by deprivation. But then the same vision spread among them, carried not by story, but by experience. 3 warriors woke gasping, each describing the same memory, a hall of crystal mirrors, where 1,000 faces reflected back, none of them their own. The precision of detail, the rhythm of description, was identical. It was not coincidence. It was not dream. It was memory, but memory unbound from ownership. Ilithar resisted longest. He kept his eyes open through restless nights, gripping his witchblade, focusing on the breath of the child that still slept against him. But eventually exhaustion overcame him, and when it did, he saw a face in the dream, a face that stared back at him through the eyes of another exile. He woke with frost in his throat, his chest heaving, and found the other warrior already watching him. Without words, they knew they had shared the same moment. Soon, it was all of them. Every exile carried fragments of the other's lives, not merely recalled, but felt. One spoke of grief for a mother's death, only to be told he had never had a mother. The memory belonged to another. Another wept for a lost battle, a failure in command, but he had never commanded. The visions passed among them like contagion, yet no one could trace their origin. Exile itself seemed to blur the boundaries, dissolving the line between self and other until memory was communal, but without harmony. Seller grew frantic. He tried to record the visions in his slate, assigning ownership, tracing patterns, but the slate cracked under the strain, the lines overlapping, names blurring. He dropped it in despair, whispering, "No memory belongs, no identity holds." The others avoided his gaze, for his words carried weight they could not deny. At first, they tried to keep silent, to hold their borrowed visions within, but silence became unbearable. Around their dim fires they began to recite them, sharing not for comfort but for necessity, as if speaking might fix the fragments into place. Yet, as they spoke, the boundaries dissolved further. One warrior described a child's laughter, another interrupted, claiming he too remembered the sound. A third insisted it was his memory, though he had never known kin. The circle became argument, not of anger, but of despair, each voice grasping for ownership that slipped like ice through fingers. The child in Ilithor's arms stirred often during these recitations, its small hands clenching as though clutching echoes of lives it had not yet lived. Elitha began to fear the nameless infant was absorbing them all, a vessel for memories abandoned by those who no longer knew which belonged to whom. One night, Ilithor dreamed of a woman's face, gentle, familiar, but not his. When he woke, he found another warrior staring at him, eyes wide, lips whispering the same description. They both knew the face. They both carried her, yet neither could claim her as mother, as lover, as kin. She belonged to no one, and because of that, she belonged to everyone. Madness crept into their march. Warriors stumbled, speaking names that had never been theirs, recalling battles they had never fought. The static that once haunted their prayers now bled into memory itself, distorting past into blur. They no longer spoke of the craft worlds with certainty, for even those memories frayed. Were they exiles from a single vessel, or had they been many, scattered, now collapsed into one? None could answer. None dared try. Seller stopped writing altogether. He sat apart, muttering fragments of lives and cycles, as if reciting them endlessly might anchor them. Yet each repetition altered, the details shifting. His eyes grew hollow, his slate shattered at his feet. Elithor feared he was already gone, consumed not by hunger or cold, but by memory that no longer belonged. Still, the exiles walked. They carried their blades, their armor whispering in runes, their child nameless in Ilithor's arms. But they walked as strangers to themselves, each step accompanied by lives that flickered in their minds and dissolved before they could be claimed at night. They gathered in silence. None dared speak the visions aloud anymore. The weight was too great. Yet the air between them vibrated faintly, heavy with memories none owned, heavy with the ghosts of selves that had never been dot. In exile, the greatest wound was not hunger, not silence, not even the closing of the webway. It was this: to lose ownership of memory, to carry lives that dissolved into blur, to wake each morning with the knowledge that what you recalled did not belong to you. They no longer dreamed of home. They no longer dreamed of salvation. They dreamed of faces they could not name, battles they had not fought, children they had not born. The weight of it bent them, hollowed them, erased them, and in the snowbound silence, the exiles began to wonder if they were even themselves, or if they had become vessels for memories that belonged to no one at all. It began as habit, as instinct carried forward by muscle and training. The exiles had lived too long upon the path of the warrior to let it go entirely. When frost plains stretched endless before them, they arranged themselves into formations. When ridges loomed, they fortified them. When storms howled, they raised their weapons and fired volleys into the wind. At first it seemed a way to hold discipline, to preserve memory of what they had been. But as days passed, it grew larger, more organized, until they found themselves waging a campaign with no adversary to fight. Seller drew lines across snow with the edge of his slate, marking supply routes and defensive arcs. Others obeyed without question, establishing perimeters, digging trenches, patrolling corridors of ice as though an army lurked just beyond sight. The nameless child slept at the center of these defenses, wrapped in scraps of cloth, as though it were the heart of a fortress. Ilithor watched with unease, but said nothing. He too felt the pull of ritual, felt the old reflex to prepare for war, even when no foe appeared. The first volleys were ceremonial. Warriors raised shuriken catapults and fired into the storm, their shots slicing white arcs across gray skies. The sound echoed back from ridges, thin but sharp, mimicking return fire that never came. The warriors responded as if it had it, adjusting their stances, spreading wider, calling out signals with hands raised high. Soon their drills became indistinguishable from battle itself. Nights were worse. Some swore they heard enemy footsteps across the frozen plains, shapes moving in shadows. They roused the camp in alarm, sending volleys into darkness. When the snow settled, nothing stirred, no bodies lay broken. Yet they felt the rhythm of combat in their veins, the rush of anticipation that needed no foe to be real. It was not deception. It was rehearsal, repeated until rehearsal itself became war. Ilithar tried to resist. He told himself it was madness, that absence had taken form only in their hunger and dread. Yet even he fell into rhythm. When the call for advance rang out, his blade rose instinctively, its hum vibrating against the silence. He found himself lunging into empty space, striking at shadows, parrying blows that did not exist. His heart raced, his breath burned, his body trembled, as if the fight were true. When he lowered his weapon, nothing surrounded him but frost and fog. Still his pulse thundered as though he had survived slaughter. Cellar marked victories upon his slate, lines scratched across surface in neat rows. Enemy routed, he scrawled, positions secured. The others nodded, their armor glowing faintly with pride, though no blood stained their blades. They congratulated one another with silence, gestures of acknowledgement that held as much weight as any triumph of real war. The days stretched into campaign. They marched across frozen valleys, leaving behind trenches carved in snow. Banners of torn cloth staked into drifts, as though to mark territory reclaimed. When they reached a ridge, they entrenched for days, firing salvos at the horizon, whispering of enemy movements. They described in detail the assaults they had endured, the strategies that had saved them, though none of it had ever occurred. And yet the memory of it lived among them, as real as hunger. Warriors bore themselves with exhaustion after battles they had not fought, limping on legs unscarred, clutching wounds that did not exist. They sang, in faint whispers, hymns of victory into the storm. The lines between truth and ritual blurred until absence itself was enemy, and absence itself was being defeated. The child grew amidst this phantom war, swaddled in cloth, darkened by frost. It did not cry when volleys cracked overhead. It did not stir when warriors shouted signals across the wind. Its silence became part of the campaign, as though it too understood that war no longer needed foe. Ilithar began to fear the most dangerous thing exile had given them was not hunger or silence, not static or eclipse. It was this, the instinct to continue war, even when war was gone. He dreamed of endless fields of soldiers locked in battle, with nothing, striking shadows, bleeding from wounds never made, marching forever into void. He woke with frost in his lungs and realized the dream was only an echo of what already was. On the 27th night of their campaign, Cellar declared victory. He stood at the center of camp, slate in hand, voice trembling but proud. "The enemy is broken," he said. "The war is won." The others gathered, silent but solemn, their blades lowered, their armor dulled but unyielding. They believed it. They needed to. And yet, when dawn came, the horizon was unchanged, endless white, endless silence, endless exile. No foe vanquished, no land reclaimed. Only trenches half filled with snow, weapons dulled by frost, and warriors too weary to admit they had fought only against absence. Ilithar stood apart, the child in his arms, staring into the void where they had fired so many shots. The air was still, the silence unbroken. He wondered if absence had ever been enemy at all, or if they themselves had become the enemy, rehearsing their own erasure until nothing remained. They found it at the edge of a canyon, half buried in ice, a ring of wraith bone rising from the frozen earth, like a relic from a forgotten age. Even before they recognized it, they felt a tan ache at the edges of thought. a pull in the marrow of their bones. It was a webway gate. Its curve was cracked, its surface dulled, but its presence was undeniable. For a moment, the exiles froze in disbelief, their breaths fogging inside their helms. To see a gate here, abandoned, was to glimpse the possibility of return. They approached cautiously, weapons lowered, armor creaking with frost. Ilithar carried the nameless child close against his chest, every step trembling between fear and hope. He remembered the gates of his craft world, alive with light, humming with resonance, portals that opened onto eternity. This gate was silent, but silence itself did not dissuade him. He stepped closer, heart pounding, expecting glow, expecting song. Nothing came. Instead, a pressure pressed outward from the structure, invisible, yet undeniable. It pushed into their skulls, heavy as stone, forcing breaths shallow. It was not sound, not even static, but a weight like a scream caught before release, a cry that had forgotten how to emerge. The warriors staggered, some clutching at their helms, others bracing their blades against the ground. The gate remained inert, its surface unlit, yet its rejection filled the air. Cellar tried first. He raised a spirit stone, pressing it to the wraithbone surface. The stone dimmed instantly, its faint glow consumed. He gasped, stumbling back, whispering that it had been devoured, not shattered, not destroyed, but absorbed. The gate had swallowed memory whole. Another warrior struck the frame with his blade. Sparks flew, but the weapon's hum faltered, its runes dimming as if the strike had been silenced before it landed. He fell to his knees, staring at the weapon in disbelief. The others did not dare strike again. Ilithar stepped forward, the child heavy in his arms. He placed his palm against the gate. The pressure surged instantly, a wave pressing into him, rattling the marrow of his bones. He gasped, vision swimming. For a heartbeat, he saw corridors of light stretching into infinity, then collapse. The image shattered into fragments, walls folding inward, pathways sealing, until only void remained. He staggered back, clutching the child tighter, heart hammering as though he had glimpsed the webway's corpse. The exiles gathered in a circle, weapons lowered, helms bowed. None spoke for long moments, for every breath was weighed down by that soundless pressure. When finally one whispered, it was not in hope but in dread. The labyrinth had not merely abandoned them, it had refused them. That night, they camped within sight of the gate. None slept. They watched its silhouette against the dark horizon, its cracked frame glowing faintly with frost. Some swore they saw runes flicker across its surface, sigils half-formed before vanishing. Others claimed to hear faint whispers at the edge of thought, words in languages no one had learned. Cellar muttered equations again, trying to map patterns in the silence. But his slate cracked down the center, the screen blackened, his numbers devoured. He wept silently, holding the broken device, as though it were kin. The child stirred once, opening its eyes toward the gate. Ilithar shuddered, for in that moment, the infant's gaze seemed older than exile itself, as though it recognized the structure, as though it remembered what the others had lost. Yet no cry escaped its lips. It simply stared, silent as the gate. On the third day, one warrior stepped forward, lowering his helm, arms spread wide. He whispered his oath aloud, offering himself to the gate as sacrifice, pleading for passage. The runes on his armor glowed faintly in response. For a moment, the others dared to hope. Then the pressure surged, and the warrior collapsed. His body froze instantly, the glow in his armor extinguished. He lay before the gate, lifeless, his form swallowed into silence. The gate did not open. The others dragged him away, but the act changed them. No longer did they speak of the gate as salvation. They spoke of it as tomb. It was not a portal to eternity, but a monument to refusal, a reminder that even the labyrinth itself had turned against them. Ilithar remained awake the longest, the child pressed to his chest, staring at the structure. He remembered walking those corridors once, feeling the hum beneath his feet, the chorus of voices guiding him forward. Now, even memory had been stolen. He whispered words into the night, words of prayer, of anger, of plea. The gate answered with nothing, not silence, but pressure, weight, the soundless scream that crushed every syllable before it left his lips. When dawn came, they marched again. None looked back, though the gate's presence lingered in their thoughts like a shadow. They carried the weight with them, a certainty heavier than hunger, heavier than exile itself. The webway was not lost. It was closed, and in its refusal, the exiles finally understood the truth. The labyrinth did not forget them. It denied them. The frozen marches ended at last upon soil that was not entirely dead. Beneath the thinning snow, they saw remnants of stonework, columns broken by centuries, plazas sunken into ruin. It was a maiden world, or what remained of one, a place once shaped with purpose, now abandoned to silence. The air here was different, faintly warmer, carrying echoes of voices long vanished. The exiles slowed as they entered the ruins, their boots crunching across shattered tiles patterned in designs none could quite remember but all instinctively recognized. At the heart of the plaza, half buried in frost, stood the statue. Its form rose taller than any warrior, carved of pale stone, weathered smooth by ages. Its shape was Eldar, but not specific and idealized form. Neither male nor female, bearing features too perfect to be real. Its hands stretched outward, palms open, as if in offering or judgment. Its face was blank, serene, unreadable. They did not speak its name, for they knew none. Yet every gaze bent toward it, as though before divinity. Illithor approached first, the nameless child pressed to his chest. He felt warmth radiating faintly from the stone, a contrast to the endless frost that had claimed every other world. He laid his hand upon the base. It was not alive, not wraithbone, yet it pulsed faintly beneath his palm, a rhythm not unlike heartbeat. His witchblade hummed at his side, low and steady, as though in recognition. The others gathered, kneeling in silence, unsure if they approached shrine or relic. Cellar lifted his slate, attempting to mark the runes etched faintly into its surface, but the symbols shifted before his eyes, rearranging in sequences that dissolved the moment he traced them. He lowered the slate, defeated, whispering that the statue remembered, but not in language the exiles could hold. Then came the fracture. A crack split across the statue's chest, sharp and sudden, echoing through the plaza like a blade striking stone. The exiles flinched, weapons raised, but no enemy descended. The crack widened, light spilling forth. Not fire, not plasma, but pure radiance, searing and soft all at once. It poured into the ruin, reflecting across broken columns. Flooding their helms with brilliance, they fell to their knees, not by command, but by instinct. Some lowered their heads in reverence, others lifted their hands to shield their visors, eyes burning from the glow. The statue bled light, not in torrent, but in steady stream, as though a wound in divinity had been opened and could not close. Illithor held the child tighter, his body trembling. The infant's eyes opened, wide and unblinking, staring into the radiance without fear. The light played across its face, outlining features too small, too fragile, yet in that glow seemed carved into permanence. Illithor's breath caught. He whispered words he did not mean to, words of liturgy he thought forgotten, syllables that tasted like forgiveness and plea alike. The others began to murmur, not prayer, not song, but fractured words spilling from lips as if dragged out by the light. Each voice different, each language shifting, some in Eldar tongue, others in dialects older still. They spoke names of gods no one remembered, promises no one believed, apologies for sins they could not name. Their voices wove together not into chorus but into desperation. Each warrior unsure whether they were worshipping or begging forgiveness. Cellar pressed his slate to the ground. recording not words but the rhythm of the light itself, its pulse captured in jagged lines. His hands shook, his visor fogged, but he did not stop. He whispered, "It is a message. It is a ledger." But when he looked again, the lines had erased themselves, the slate blank, as though ashamed of having tried to hold revelation. The statue's crack widened. More light spilled forth, searing through air, bending shadows into unnatural arcs. The plaza trembled. Stones shifted. Ancient carvings crumbled. Yet the exiles did not move. They knelt as though pinned, bound not by chains but by awe. One warrior broke at last. He rose, his blade raised, his voice raw. He cried that the light was judgment, that it condemned them for their exile. He struck at the statue's base. His blade met stone and shattered. Fragments scattered across the tiles, runes dimming instantly. The light did not falter. The warrior fell back, his hands bleeding, his eyes blind. The others did not aid him. They could not look away from the radiance. Illithor lowered his helm, tears he did not feel burning his cheeks. He whispered again, this time not prayer, not plea, but question. "What are we to you?" The light pulsed in reply, steady and indifferent. It offered no answer, no condemnation, no absolution, only presence. When dawn came, the statue still bled light, though softer now, dimming into glow rather than blaze. The exiles rose slowly, their bodies stiff, their voices hoarse from whispers they could not remember speaking. The blinded warrior lay silent, his breath shallow, his face serene despite ruin. Cellar's slate lay shattered, its surface erased. They marched on, leaving the plaza behind. Yet the light lingered in their vision, burned into retinas, carved into thought. Some whispered still, names half-formed, prayers incomplete. Illithar carried the child, its small hands still clenched as though grasping radiance itself. The ruins faded behind them, but the statue's presence followed, for they all knew they had not seen God, nor idol, nor kin. They had seen something greater, something that neither judged nor forgave, but existed beyond both. And they had knelt, uncertain whether in worship or in apology. The warning came not from augurs, nor from scouts, but from the sky itself. Streaks of fire broke through the thin clouds, burning lines carved into the firmament. The exiles raised their eyes and knew without words, an enemy fleet had come. Whether human, orc, or something older, did not matter. The banners of their foes carried no weight here. What mattered was that they were seen. For too long, exile had meant silence, erasure, the slow death of memory. But now, at last, someone had marked their existence enough to strike. They formed ranks across the plain, battered armor glistening faintly with frost, weapons humming low like the tuning of instruments before a Illithor stood at the front, the nameless child held against his chest. He passed the infant to Cellar, whose trembling hands closed around it as though accepting sacred relic. No words were spoken. The act itself was vow. Illithor drew his witchblade and let its resonance flood the air, sharp and clear, a sound that dared the void to answer. The enemy descended swiftly, ships landing in clouds of fire, disgorging soldiers in ranks far greater than the exiles could hope to match. The ground shook beneath iron boots, the horizon filled with gunmetal and banners. Against such a tide, even survival was absurd. But survival was not what the exiles sought. They sought witness. If they were to vanish, let it be in motion, let it be in defiance. The first volley roared across the plain. Shuriken discs tore through air, glowing trails stitching lines across enemy ranks. The return fire was thunder, heavy rounds, carving craters in ice, searing blasts igniting the snow itself. Warriors fell, their bodies consumed, their armor cracked, but their weapons sang louder. Ghost blades danced arcs of light against steel. Witchblades carved through armor. Catapults spat defiance until their drums ran dry. Every strike carried weight beyond survival. They did not fight for Craftworld, for destiny, for future. They fought for the act of being seen one final time. Each motion was elegy. Each parry was testament. To fall unseen was exile's final cruelty. And so they refused it, with violence so radiant that absence could not deny them. Illithur cut through the storm, his blade humming with resonance that outshone even the statue's light. His strikes were precise, beautiful, each arc a line of poetry written in blood and frost. Enemy after enemy fell before him, their forms collapsing into the snow, their faces blurred by steam. He moved not as exile, but as warrior reborn, not because victory awaited, but because the moment demanded witness. Cellar clutched the child against his chest, shielding it as fire rained around him. Yet even he raised his catapult, firing bursts into the tide. His voice, usually quiet, broke into raw cries as he spat numbers into the storm, not calculations, but rhythm. Each figure shouted like battle hymn. He was not tallying survival. He was declaring presence, proof that they had not vanished silently into the snow. The battle raged without pause. Warriors fell, one by one, their bodies collapsing into heaps of frost and blood. Yet their weapons continued to hum, runes glowing faintly even in death, blades whispering songs of artisans long gone. In the din of fire and scream, those relics remembered more faithfully than flesh. As the tide pressed closer, the exiles drew into tighter formation. They did not retreat. They stepped forward together, blades crossing, bodies locking into rhythm. Their movements became dance, each strike answering another, each fall met with new surge. They were no longer individuals. They were one dirge made flesh, one song of defiance hammered into steel and motion. When Illithur fell to his knees, blade buried in an enemy's chest, he raised his eyes to the sky. The eclipse was gone now, the sun bleeding pale light across the horizon. He smiled faintly behind his helm, not for victory, but for recognition. They had been marked. They had not vanished unseen. Cellar held the child tighter, pressing his helm against its small head as blasts rained around them. He whispered words no one else heard, fragments of prayer, fragments of apology. His weapon fired until it jammed, until his hands bled, until he too collapsed beneath the weight of numbers. By dusk, the plain was silent again. Bodies lay in heaps, armor cracked, weapons dimmed. The enemy collected their dead and withdrew, their banners fading into horizon. They left no marker, no inscription, no acknowledgement. Yet the ground itself bore witness scars, carved by volleys, craters marked by defiance, snow stained by blood that refused to vanish. Among the corpses, one sound remained, the child's breath, small, steady, unbroken. It had survived, cradled in arms that no longer moved. Its silence was louder than battle, proof that exile had not erased them fully. The last dance of the blades was finished. Not victory, not salvation, but presence. They had been seen, and for warriors' long denied memory, that was enough. When the echoes of battle faded, nothing remained but stillness. Smoke drifted in thin veils across the plain, settling into hollows carved by fire. The enemy had gone, their ships tearing back into the sky, their banners vanished beyond horizon. No one came to claim the field. No songs were sung, no cries of triumph or mourning. Only silence remained on for the first time. It was not exile's punishment, it was choice. The survivors gathered among the fallen. Few stood, fewer still spoke. Illithur lifted the child from Cellar's lifeless arms, pressing it close, its tiny breaths steady against the ruin of his armor. Around him, warriors bent their heads, not to pray, not to grieve, but to rest. The urge to speak, to rehearse memory, to resist silence, no longer tugged at them. Words had failed them too many times. Songs had dissolved into static. Only silence held. They did not bury the dead. They left armor and blade where each warrior had fallen, glowing runes fading slowly in the dusk. Not neglect, but reverence. To cover them would be to deny the stillness they had earned. For the first time, exile was not erasure, was embrace. Silence chose them, and they accepted. Illithor walked to the center of the plain, the child heavy in his arms. He lowered his helm, letting the wind brush frost across his skin. He did not whisper prayer. He did not ask forgiveness. He simply breathed, and in that breath felt the weight of exile dissolve. No longer burden, no longer punishment. Silence had become their home. The others followed, forming a circle around him. They knelt, not in supplication but in belonging. For the first time since their exile began, there was no need to resist, no need to remember, no need to hope. The silence was not absence. It was presence final whole, undeniable. Above them, the sky dimmed. No eclipse, no judgment, no promise, only vast stillness stretching without end. They did not raise their eyes. They did not need to, for silence was no longer a wound. It was their inheritance. And so the exiles ceased to march. They ceased to fight. They ceased to ask. They simply remained, cradled by the silence that had once hunted them, now folded into it by choice. The nameless child's breath was the only sound left, a soft rhythm threading through the stillness, not breaking it but completing it. The silence did not forget them. The silence became them, and so the tale of the exiled Eldar does not end with victory, nor with defeat, but with the silence that chose them. Cast out, abandoned, stripped of memory, they found in absence what chorus and war could not give: belonging without need, presence without voice. Their weapons, their prayers, their very names dissolved into the stillness. Yet something endured the breath of a nameless child, carried forward into what comes next. Whether symbol, curse, or fragile hope, none could say. But exile had transformed, no longer punishment, no longer denial. It had become home. This was not triumph, nor tragedy. It was elegy, the final truth of warriors who discovered that silence, once resisted, could also be embraced. And in that embrace, they were no longer forgotten. They were complete.